what we thought we'd do is make this just a bit more informal, and it was going to be informal anyway, but now I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. I think instead of sort of having a formal panel discussion, I might just start by sort of asking Joe and Andrew, who are the remaining members of our panel, whether you had any thoughts or any reflections on what you've heard today, and sort of to start with, and then maybe thinking about whether you guys have any thoughts on sort of taking things forward, whether there's other things that we could think about doing. So. Joe, do you want to go first?
I'll go first, just get out of the way.
Sure.
So just a couple of thoughts. And I just want to make a comment on the back of Andrew Wilson's comments earlier. So in the way that the committee's currently working, and as you can tell by a couple of the examples he gave, our inputs come on behalf of children from parents and carers or their clinicians. That's how our inputs are currently coming. If they're not actually captured in the sponsor submission itself, the inputs we rely on are coming through the parents and carers. So the other aspect that I think might be interesting to you all is that in the last couple of years, especially probably since COVID, we're getting more video inputs now. So the notion of a before and after for those who have experienced the new medicine or intervention, and that has been a challenge for some of us in terms of how we want to deal with that as inputs and what we try and do with that in terms of framing what can be some pretty, distressing and compelling sort of input at a visual point without any other sort of context in the ways that you would all understand a reasonable way to assess that. So I just put that into your thoughts. Good luck with that. So 3 things I wanted to come away with. One was, if we're trying to improve things, it's often around the notion of trying to improve uncertainty, right? And in our language, we talk about risk. So I guess one of the things that I was reflecting on listening to you all today was that you're probably more aware now that in terms of trying to deal with our current uncertainties, we're pretty blunt. We try and find the pragmatic way forward. And as Jinjin knows, the PSDs are not a good way of really understanding how we've come to that. So if you're thinking about ways that the committee can be more supported in its roles, I'm not sure we can do justice to the work you're bringing to this. So that brings me to my second point is, what are we doing about trying to convince sponsors and be at the end where the clinical trials are being designed and where we can capture this in a more timely and reasonable way so that it is ready for true evaluation. Because coming up at my end, sitting down with a bunch of families and their doctors is a very different proposition in terms of what we can reasonably do in terms of extracting a better understanding of the intervention or the impacts of that or not. And then finally, I guess, and I'll leave this with you all, we've heard about, the question of whether or not there is one answer to this, or whether or not it's even reasonable to think about that. But I guess the other thing for me is, what about targeting? So if we've got a rare disease, if we've got something that's truly claiming life extension or a very profound or compelling change, as we saw with something like spinal muscular atrophy, is that something we would target all this extra effort and work for? or is it actually the converse? Because I think I would say that we do pretty well with rare diseases in the sense that we tend to get them up one way or the other. Our blunt way of being pragmatic sort of gets something listed and available. It's the broader population stuff that doesn't have, I think, as much scrutiny, but requires a lot more sort of layers of thinking through true outcomes across, variable population use. That might require this in a more sort of urgent way. So I just leave those thoughts with you.
Thanks, Jo. Andrew?
Thanks, Jo. I have a microphone ready. So everything that Jo said, endorse. I guess in reacting to the day and the questions that Kirsten threw at me by email just as I was in the car getting here.
Sorry.
I went back to 1998 to 2006, and for those who don't know me, I was kind of involved in bringing a lot of the expectations as to what PBS and MSAC get in the submissions by couching guidelines and things. In 1999, we commissioned a couple of reports and then some commentaries on those reports as a department on monetary valuation and utility valuation. And the threshold question is, does PBAC move into a valuation system as the basis for making its decisions? And up until then, 2006, it was, if you could, it'd be nice if you did, but it was not an expectation. So the threshold question was, should PBAC move to a valuation recommendation? And if so, was it monetary or was it utility? And of course, you've seen the results, it was utility. And then there's a question, well, what constituted an acceptable utility valuation? And that was I guess, where I can see some parallels to what's the outputs of all these Quokka and Torch results, and what will we do with this as outputs for researchers, inputs for expectations to what go to committees. And so some of the principles that were established then might be relevant to think about now, in particular in terms of how you couch some of the recommendations for next steps in the papers that get published. So I guess one of them was, and I'll just go through that a little bit sort of scale at the moment, was we defined a minimum data set as being, it's got to be preference-based. It couldn't be just any old generic quality type instrument. And the preference-based in those days were Just Stand & Gamble, TTO. DCE was just in the horizon. You've heard of this, BWS. It was just not there at all. This whole requirement, therefore, anchoring, because at least SG and TTO were anchored by intrinsically. So that was the first requirement. But then the second one was, do we, as a system, expect one? And there were three main candidates at the time. AQUAL, who's ever heard of AQUAL now? HUI, which is still bumbling around. But everyone's now using the EQ5D. That wasn't a good instrument in those days because it only had 3 levels, and the responsiveness was really nothing to die for. So there wasn't a strong candidate, and what the principle then was, if there's no single best, then allow any of them, and that's pragmatic, and it allows progress without being too early constrained to one particular system that may end up dying or whatever. So I think there's some thinking when you've got your 16 valuation systems, should any one of them prevail? Well, if it hasn't, the dust hasn't settled, then I think it's not good for an end user system to define this is what we should be doing. So I think there's some qualifications that can come out of that. The idea of having a questionnaire that is used within a trial to elicit the views of the respondents who actually benefit the outcome changes. Big plus. So it's multi-utility instruments. Then the next question was, whose values do you apply? In other words, the algorithms that come around. And it's very clearly that would be the general population, and for Australia, of course, preference for Australian population. So again, I think that starts to come into play with the parents' views, the child's views, and so forth. I think there are some prior principles that can be reflected when deciding which is recommended. But there was great attraction to that separation of respondent and algorithm, which made a lot of sense at the time. vignettes and mapping were very much not attracted at all, and I think PBAC and MSAC have seen and have still had doubts about some of the mapping exercises that have subsequently been presented to it, so I don't think that's changed. One of the downsides in allowing a multiplicity of valuation systems is the sense, and this came up in some of the qualitative research presented today, the sense of gaming. You know, you find the instrument that's most likely to give you the results you want. And I do remember very clearly that the Huey instrument was used for most of the vision-related interventions, because Huey was the only one that had vision in the domain. And you would get a very different consequence for eyesight-related medicine if you used Huey than if you used the other measures. So you kind of expect that's going to happen, and you prepare for it, and it's kind of a consequence. Another thought that's come to me is that if we're going to elicit childhood qualities in a different way, and we're also going to determine whether we think there's a variation should apply to qualities generated for children, do you do both? Or do you do one, or do you do the other? I think there's somewhere in there was a question that bubbled in my mind. I don't know how you resolve that. I feel uncomfortable with the sense of double counting, that you both elicit from children and then you'd also say that we think a quality from a child is different than a quality from an adult. I think you've got to do one or the other, but I don't know which one you would do. But you've obviously prepared for both. I think it leaves the question open as to what you do. And I'll finish my remarks with what next, even broader than child versus adult. There's another part of the population that PBS and MSAC gets, which I would call either irrational or reduced mental capacity. And I'm thinking schizophrenia, dementia. You're inevitably requiring proxies. I think you've thought a lot of your way through proxies versus direct elicitation. Is that of any relevance to what I think would be another big area? So to finish off with, 1998 to 2006, such a sparse data set to make those sorts of decisions as to where to go next, compared to the richness that we've got in 2024, just amazing. Well done.
Thank you. So I guess just open it up for other questions or comments or thoughts from other people, people in the room. So,
This Joe, I didn't quite follow. You said there were the before and after videos. Are they actually
consumer
part of the
areas.
submissions, or that comes from the?
No, they come from the community, so it's sent in by parents or grandparents. They're pretty much in my assessment, I think they're pretty much all about kids. So it's all about the kids' submissions, and it's the pretty extreme ones. So showing, as I said before, like one recent one was for that horrible condition PFIC where the kids scratch themselves till they bleed. So the video was showing that. Then after the child was able to access the medication, the after. And, and there's other examples of other conditions as well, but I was trying to make the point more to say those sort of visual inputs put us in an uncomfortable situation of not being able to, or reasonably, just dismiss them out of hand, but how do we deal with them and what do we say are their, their value to the process, right? Or not. And if we are going to say that, then, how do we say that in a way that is evidence-based and is going to be able to be communicated appropriately?
Yep.
And they're obviously potentially quite different inputs compared to using something like a PEDS qual in a clinical trial, which should be within the remit of the sponsor to actually be doing that and doing it appropriately. So there's a separate consumer input process as well as the sponsor's applications.
How do you summarise that information from the committee when they meet
No, we usually at the moment make it available to the discussants and keep them committee in confidence because that's how they come through the system.
John?
It's a different point. I suppose it was a reaction to what Andrew said about whose values matter and the general population versus the children. I suppose my reaction would be that when we're collecting data from children, we're collecting from a general population of the affected group. In the same way as with adults, we have a general population of the affected group. And I guess my thinking is if we insist, well, I suppose is what would be your rationale for saying we have to have the general population of adults to give values for children? One might be that they're taxpayers, one might be that they're citizens with sort of voting rights. But the other option would be actually to have general populations that include our young people that value all of our different measures. And that would then allow, I guess, all of those cognitively able who are in the general population to be part of that general population valuation. So it was just some thoughts that really arose from what you said.
Okay. I suspect we've reached the end of our mental capacity and the end of the day. Is there, Alison? Yes?
Sorry. On the question of your videos, Joe, I'm
Wow, this is going
To
to
me,
be
it's
dinner time.
very uncomfortable because, you know, you're looking at a video of one child who probably had a very good response to the medication, and I just don't see how that could be taken in the same light as a randomised control trial. I just think it applies.
It's not taken in the same light. It's
No,
just
no, it's
another
not,
bit of
but
information.
I was just trying to give an example of how inputs have changed over time as well.
Right.
So what was once a parent writing in saying,
Yep.
we need this, we want this, to then doing work with the community groups and getting now submissions that are characterised from the parents as being much more informed, much more reasonable in terms of talking through what they perceive to be the benefits, blah, blah. Then the next level now is the videos to show.
Which is very compelling.
That's
I
right,
suppose.
that's right.
And how do you take that evidence? What do you do with it?
Yeah, but also in my role, as I said, if you're going to go back and say don't do it, we don't want to use it, and these are the reasons why. Does that give any of you pause in terms of thinking, well, how could you use them in another way? And are they part of something that should be part of the submission, as Kirsten said, and put together in another way, in the form of evidence provided by the sponsor?
I guess if you, sorry, being allowed. I guess if you had, I guess one way you could use them potentially would be if you knew what that child's PED score was pre and post, then you could use the video as a visual explanation of what that PED score value actually meant to the child, which would then mean that you're not necessarily just having the most extreme child, because I guess that's the concern, is that, like you say, the one who's sent through is the one who's the most extreme with the best reaction. But if you could have the videos that relate to the sort of points on the trial, then that might give you a better idea of what it actually means in your decision making if you do or don't take on that decision.
I mean, I think you're separating the concept of an advocate versus evaluation, and that's one of the reasons why we went for the general population as the basis for evaluation, because if you besmirch or confuse the data with the advocacy role, saying I want to put an infinite value on this increment of health gain because I really want this. And so that was, I think, part of this moderation of the patient input to, and particularly many of the sponsors were just well able to harness this for their purposes as opposed to, I think, straight up and down. We just want to get to the guts of what this increment of health really means, both in terms of quantitative and a quality scale, or qualitative in terms of impact, as might be voiced in the video. So to me, a lot of the issue here is separating advocacy from genuine straight-up evaluation, which is more comparable across all applications, all health state changes. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that's why we're separating the evaluation step from the respondent. We really want to know what the respondent got in terms of the change in health state from before treatment to after treatment on average across the population. That's your driver of your denominator. What then does that mean in value terms? Well, let's get the and really I'm indifferent about whether that's a representative sample of the general population, including young people, middle-aged people, old people, but it becomes more acute when you're looking at the paediatric population's health states, and whether that should be intrinsically different. And I think there is a prior question, which is why I was trying to focus that out, and the value about using a MAUI, which allows you to do response elicitation and then evaluation separately.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. We greatly appreciate you giving up your day, your time to be here. I think before the torch people go, I think Kim would like to take a team photo, so don't disappear immediately. Otherwise, for those of us who are staying, we'll see you at dinner tonight if you're coming along. So thank you everyone. I think it's been a really interesting and useful day, and I think from my perspective I've got quite a lot of notes written here about things that we can take forward and discuss over the next couple of days with the rest of the Torch team. So thank you everyone, much appreciated.